The first warning sign didn't announce itself with sirens or shouting. It showed up on an ordinary Tuesday morning, disguised as something completely harmless. Karen from the compliance department walked over to my workstation, set a document flat on my desk, and said two words I rarely heard directed at me. "You forgot." I looked down at the paper and felt a strange chill run through me. Forgetting paperwork wasn't something I did. In 13 years at Meridian Core Solutions, I had built a reputation around precision. People knew me as the woman who caught errors before they happened, the one who never let anything slip through. But today, apparently, something had. I signed the document without a word and watched her walk away. Then I turned back to the mountain of responsibilities waiting on my desk. 3 screens cast their blue glow across my face. 2 half-finished cups of tea sat cooling near my keyboard. A yellow sticky note with the words, "Check Section 9" was clinging to the edge of my monitor. On the surface, everything looked exactly like it always did. Behind my chair, the office moved at its usual frenetic pace. Project leads strutted between desks, debating ideas they had borrowed from someone else. Developers threw technical jargon at each other like weapons. One of the newer interns had been looping the same 15 seconds of music through his earbuds so loudly that the entire row could hear it. And while everyone around me competed for attention, I sat in my corner doing the work that genuinely kept things running. My name was Catherine Moore, Senior Systems Compliance Architect, according to my official title. Unofficially, I was the woman quietly preventing a $300 million transaction from collapsing while everyone else rehearsed their victory speeches. For the better part of a year, I had been constructing the regulatory backbone connecting Meridian Core with a global corporation called Pinnacle Accord. The merger was the kind of deal executives put in press releases and shareholders toasted at dinner parties. Everyone talked about it constantly, yet the vast majority of those people had absolutely no understanding of how delicate the underlying structure truly was. I did, because I was the one who constructed it. Every security layer, every regulatory handoff, every compliance checkpoint, every fail-safe embedded into the process. While the executives gave interviews and smiled for cameras, I was the one at 11 at night making sure the promises they made were even possible. I wasn't celebrated inside those walls. I wasn't well known. Most people in the building couldn't have told you exactly what I did on any given day, and that arrangement suited me perfectly. People who go unnoticed tend to learn the most. They hear what gets said when no one is performing. They see who people actually are when they stop pretending. My position came attached to a federal compliance certification that almost no one else had pursued. Earning it had required months of intensive training, multiple rounds of background investigation, legal clearances, psychological assessments, and formal audits. By the end of the process, I held authorization credentials that were structurally woven into the acquisition itself. The company had granted me that authority several years earlier and then slowly stopped thinking about what it meant. I never reminded them. There was no advantage in doing so. People tend to underestimate those who don't demand attention, and when they underestimate you, they lower their guard. That's when you learn everything worth knowing. That same Tuesday morning, I logged into the deal management system to run a final check on the approval sequence. Completion was scheduled in 72 hours. Every box appeared checked, every submission confirmed, every requirement satisfied. Almost. My cursor stopped on a section I had flagged months before. A single clause buried deep in the agreement, surrounded by hundreds of pages of dense legal text. Anyone moving quickly would have scrolled right past it. I never moved quickly through things that mattered. Something about that clause had been sitting in the back of my mind since the day I first read it. So I opened my private folder, the one labeled Reserves, and reviewed the language one more time. Because there was something nobody at Meridian Core had ever grasped about the way I worked. I never designed systems around the assumption that people would do the right thing. I designed them around the reality that they often wouldn't. And reality had taught me something consistent over the years. When something goes wrong inside a corporation, the people standing nearest to the problem get handed the blame first. I had no intention of being handed anything. What I didn't yet know was that the person about to change everything had already walked through the front door. His name was Garrett Walsh, the company's newly appointed Chief Operations Officer. Senior leadership called him a visionary. The financial press called him a transformation specialist. Employees used other descriptions when they were certain he wasn't listening. The first time I saw him, he strode into a company-wide meeting wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly expenses and a smile that looked like it had been calibrated for maximum effect. For 40 minutes, he spoke about innovation, optimization, organizational agility, and strategic evolution. Everyone applauded between sentences. I opened my laptop and resolved a data synchronization error that had been quietly building for 3 days. By the time the meeting ended, I had formed a complete picture of exactly who Garrett Walsh was. He was the kind of leader who confused popularity with effectiveness, the kind who believed that cutting experienced people was a sign of strength rather than an admission that he didn't understand what those people actually did. The kind who looked at quiet employees and saw savings rather than systems. 3 hours after that meeting, there was a knock at my office door. Karen was back. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 people from Human Resources stood slightly behind her, both of them looking like they would rather be anywhere else. One of them spoke first, softly. "Catherine, could you come with us for a few minutes?" I already understood what was happening before she finished the sentence. After more than a decade in professional environments, you learn to recognize that particular combination of careful language and avoided eye contact. A door was closing, I could hear it. The conference room looked the way these rooms always do when they're being used for something uncomfortable. Neutral walls, forgettable artwork, a long table designed to create the impression of formality. The HR manager placed a folder in front of me without any preamble. "Catherine?" She began, reading from a prepared script. "Following a comprehensive review of our organizational structure, we've concluded that your current role is no longer consistent with the company's strategic direction." 12 years, distilled into a sentence written by someone who had probably been with the company for less than a year. I kept listening as they continued. Words like realignment, resource optimization, structural evolution, the standard vocabulary companies reach for when they want to avoid saying what they actually mean. Which was simply this: we've decided you're no longer worth the cost. At least, that's what they believed. One of the representatives slid another document toward me. A severance agreement, a confidentiality contract, exit procedures, all of it formatted and organized as if dismantling someone's career were just another administrative checklist. "Please return your access credentials and equipment by 3 o'clock, she said. Security has been informed. Security, not colleagues, not team members, not a person who had spent 12 years building things that mattered. A potential security concern. I nodded once. Understood. The meeting concluded in under 5 minutes. 12 years. 5 minutes. That, apparently, was how long professional loyalty was worth. I stepped into the hallway carrying the folder. Eyes shifted away from me the moment I appeared. People suddenly found their screens fascinating. Others turned toward conversations they hadn't been having moments before. No one wanted to be seen acknowledging me. That's how it works. Fear moves through office buildings faster than any message on any platform. Everyone worried that standing near the terminated person might make them the next one. As I walked toward my desk, something stopped me completely. Taped beside the reception cabinet was a printed photograph. My photograph. Someone had written across the bottom, in thick red marker, "Do not re-engage." I stood absolutely still and stared at it. For a moment, the background noise of the office disappeared entirely. The conversations, the keyboards, the phones, everything went silent. I just looked at the image. 12 years of late nights, missed weekends, solved crises, emergency fixes, and somehow I had been reduced to a label. A risk, not a person. A risk. That landed harder than the termination itself, not because I wanted their validation, because it confirmed what they actually thought, what they had probably always thought, and never had the honesty to say directly. I made myself keep walking. No raised voice, no dramatic response, no visible reaction. Anger is something people know how to manage. They have scripts for it. What they have no script for is someone who simply refuses to perform. At my desk, I collected my things into a cardboard box, a ceramic mug, a journal I had carried for years, a photograph from a company event in an earlier time, when people still knew my name and what it stood for. Across the open floor, my assistant James watched me with an expression that looked like he might actually cry. "I'm so sorry," he mouthed silently. I gave him the most reassuring look I could manage. "It'll be all right." He didn't believe me. I wasn't entirely sure I believed myself. After the box was packed, I removed my access badge and set it on the desk. The sound it made when it landed was barely audible, just a small plastic tap against laminate. But something about that tiny sound felt heavier than everything that had preceded it. Then I walked out. No send-off, no acknowledgement, no moment of recognition, just the door behind me. Outside, the afternoon light reflected off windshields in the parking structure. I sat in my car, doors locked, engine off, staring through the glass for a long moment. Then I opened a secured application on my phone. The interface requested biometric confirmation. I pressed my thumb to the screen. Access granted. What appeared was a list of compliance credentials that most people wouldn't have known how to read. I understood every item on it perfectly. The entire acquisition between Meridian Core and Pinnacle Accord depended on a specialized authorization certificate. A certificate that was assigned to me, not to the company, to me personally. Federal guidelines required an independently certified liaison to complete final authorization. Replacing that credential was possible but not simple. It required background reviews, formal verification sequences, regulatory approval, and above all else, time. I selected the credential from the list. A confirmation prompt appeared. Permanent action. Cannot be undone. Proceed? I looked at the screen for a long moment. Then I pressed confirm. The credential disappeared from the system. No announcement, no alarm, no dramatic effect. Just a quiet deletion. Without that authorization, the acquisition could not proceed through final verification. The process would reject itself automatically. Not because I had tampered with anything, because the system was working precisely as it was designed to work. I leaned back in the seat and noticed that my hands were completely steady. My breathing was slow. For the first time all day, I felt something I hadn't expected. Calm, total clarity. Because while Meridian Core's leadership was likely somewhere in a meeting congratulating each other on trimming unnecessary expenses, they had just removed the one person the entire transaction could not function without. And they had no idea. I started the car and drove home. My phone made no noise the entire way. No calls, no messages, no one checking whether I had arrived safely. Just road ahead of me and silence behind. By the time I reached my house, the sun was beginning to drop toward the horizon. I brought the cardboard box inside and set it on the kitchen table. The space felt different than it had in years. Still, no incoming alerts, no one needing something resolved by morning. For the first time in over a decade, the evening belonged entirely to me. I expected to feel relieved. What I actually felt was a very particular kind of curiosity. I wanted to know exactly how long it would take before someone at that company understood what they had done. I went to a small storage room at the back of the house. Behind stacked files and older equipment was a locked metal case, fireproof, unmarked from the outside. I opened it. Inside were years of documentation, contracts, review records, compliance reports, and one folder I had prepared specifically for a situation like this one. I called it reserves. I opened it and turned to the page that mattered most. Clause 9, subsection C, the clause that appeared in the middle of a document that hundreds of people had signed without reading. It stated clearly that the certified independent liaison overseeing the transaction could not be removed prior to completion without an authorized replacement receiving full regulatory recertification. Any failure to meet this requirement would automatically void transaction validity. I read it twice, then a third time. Not because I needed to confirm the language, because I wanted to sit with the full weight of what it meant. The people who had terminated my employment had never once read the agreement they spent an entire year celebrating. They had assumed that someone had managed the details. Someone always had. That someone had always been me. I closed the folder and set it on the table. A quiet understanding settled over me. The acquisition wasn't delayed. It was already finished. The only remaining variable was how much time it would take before everyone involved understood that. The first visible crack appeared the following morning. At 8:52, someone inside Meridian Core initiated the final verification sequence. The system rejected it immediately. Authorization failure. Most employees would never see that notification. It traveled through compliance infrastructure, not through the dashboards executives monitored. Initially, everyone assumed the software had encountered a glitch. Companies almost always assume that first. If something doesn't work, blame the technology. 60 minutes later, they attempted the sequence again. The result was identical. By mid-morning, the issue had been escalated. By noon, a very quiet form of panic had begun moving through the building. Meanwhile, I was at my kitchen table, watching the rain streak down the glass with a warm cup of coffee in front of me. My phone vibrated. An unknown number. I let it ring. A minute later, another call from the same number. I set the phone face down. Then an email arrived. Subject line, urgent compliance matter. Sender, Pinnacle Accord, legal. Earlier than I had anticipated, I opened it. The message was careful and professional, as legal correspondence tends to be. They needed confirmation regarding my current employment status. Nothing more explicit than that. But the subtext was perfectly clear. They had already identified that something was wrong. I wrote back a single sentence. I am no longer employed by Meridian Core Solutions, effective yesterday. I attached my termination documentation and pressed send. 3 minutes passed. Then my phone rang. This time I picked it up. The voice belonged to Nathan Reeves, Pinnacle Accord's Director of Regulatory Affairs. I had worked with him for the better part of a year. He was one of those rare executives who actually read what he signed. Good afternoon, Nathan. A pause followed. Then he asked me quietly to tell him this was some kind of administrative error. It isn't, I told him. He went silent. Then, they terminated you. Yes, and as far as I'm aware, no replacement has been assigned or certified. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. I could hear him processing. Finally, he spoke again. They cannot do that. Legally, they can terminate anyone they choose. That's not what I mean, he said. They can't complete the acquisition. That's exactly right, I confirmed. Neither of us said anything for a moment. There was nothing more that needed to be said. We both already understood the full picture. Months of preparation, an enormous sum of money, hundreds of hours of coordinated work. All of it stopped cold because someone wanted to reduce payroll before a shareholder meeting. After the call, I reached out to my attorney, Marcus Lynn, the kind of lawyer who sounds completely relaxed when describing catastrophic legal situations. Within the hour, he had prepared formal documents confirming my termination and the official end of all my professional obligations related to the transaction. The moment those documents reached Pinnacle Accord's legal department, everything froze. Every approval sequence, every fund transfer, every authorization protocol, every verification process. The entire machine went still, like an engine that had suddenly run completely dry. And somewhere inside Meridian Core headquarters, people were beginning to realize that something was very, very wrong. Around 4 in the afternoon, James sent me a text. Just 4 words. What is Clause 9? I read it and set the phone down. A moment later, another message appeared. Everyone here is panicking. Then, legal just pulled the full acquisition files. I couldn't stop myself from smiling. The language had escaped the folder. Someone had found it, and now it was moving through the building like a current. I typed a short reply. Read the full subsection carefully. Then I put the phone on the table. Within 5 minutes, it was buzzing without stopping. Calls, messages, emails, voicemails, all coming from people who had said fewer than 100 words to me across the past 2 years. Suddenly, my name was on everyone's lips. One voicemail came from the chief financial officer, his voice carrying a new and unfamiliar quality, careful nervousness. Catherine, there seems to be an issue with the verification process on the acquisition. I was hoping you might be available for a brief conversation. An issue. $300 million suspended over nothing was not an issue. It was a reckoning. By evening, the situation inside the building had turned completely. Employees were forwarding screenshots of Clause 9 to each other. Legal teams were demanding that someone explain how this had happened. Compliance officers were reviewing everything from the beginning. Executives were looking at each other waiting for someone else to speak first. No one had answers, because no one had ever cared to understand how any of it actually worked. They had simply assumed that Catherine Moore would handle it. She always had. My phone rang one final time that evening. Garrett Walsh, the visionary, the efficiency expert, the man who had decided my position no longer aligned with the company's future direction. I watched his name on the screen until the call ended on its own. His voicemail arrived moments later. Catherine, this is Garrett. I believe there may have been some miscommunication around your departure. I'd welcome the chance to talk through the situation. Miscommunication. I deleted the message without listening to it a second time. An hour later, James sent another update. The board has been brought in. Nobody knew about the certification requirement. He added a final line. Garrett doesn't look well. I set the phone aside and leaned back in my chair. Outside the window, the rain had finally stopped. The clouds were separating, and pale light was beginning to come through the gaps. For months, I had carried the weight of keeping something enormous held together. Now I was sitting quietly and watching what happened when that weight was no longer being held. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is a choice you make. This was consequence, something entirely different. Companies love declaring people essential right up until the moment they decide those same people are too costly to keep. Then they discover what it actually costs to replace what those people knew, what they trusted, what they had quietly constructed over years. And that price is almost always far higher than the one they were trying to avoid paying. The next morning, Pinnacle Accord officially placed the acquisition on hold. The announcement wasn't public yet, but inside both organizations, the effect was total. Every meeting became a crisis session. Every executive became a damage control specialist. Every carefully prepared timeline became worthless paper. And for the first time in my entire career at Meridian Core, I wasn't the one cleaning up after the people who created the problem. I was the one watching from a distance, while they tried to explain to each other how the bridge had fallen. The answer, of course, was that they had removed the person holding it up. The board session began at 8 in the morning. By 8:10, it had already become something that no amount of professional composure could contain. Garrett sat at the head of the table, attempting to project control over a room that had already decided he didn't deserve it. The acquisition was frozen. Pinnacle Accord had suspended everything. Investors were making calls. Legal was buried in documents. And every thread in the room led back to the same question. Who approved Catherine Moore's termination? No one rushed to answer that question. The silence stretched. A board member named Harold Vance finally spoke. Unlike many of the people in that room, Harold was not impressed by language. He was interested only in outcomes. He laid out the situation in a single sentence. A $300 million deal has been stopped because one person was let go. No one corrected him because no one could. The general counsel cleared his throat. Technically, she held a rather specialized function. Harold's expression didn't change. Then why was she treated like a standard employee reduction? Still no answer. Garrett attempted a response about operational restructuring and forward-looking organizational design. Harold placed his hand flat on the table. The sound stopped the room. No, he said quietly. That word did more damage than shouting would have. No more prepared language. He looked directly at Garrett. Who made the call to remove the only certified liaison attached to this transaction? Every person at the table turned in the same direction at the same moment. And for the first time since his arrival, Garrett Walsh looked like something other than the confident leader he had performed so carefully. He looked like someone who had just realized the full cost of a decision he hadn't bothered to understand before making it. 3 miles away, I was sitting at the desk in my new home office reviewing the formation documents for my consulting company. The contrast in atmosphere was difficult to overstate. No raised voices, no emergency, no one demanding the impossible before the end of the business day. Just quiet, the kind that comes when you stop absorbing other people's consequences. My phone vibrated. A message from Marcus. You are suddenly very in demand. I sent back a single word. How bad? His reply was brief. I have received 7 calls this morning. Executives, legal teams, 1 person representing the board. The board, I noted. That meant the understanding had finally reached the people with actual authority. This was no longer a software malfunction or a paperwork delay. It was structural, and they needed the architect of the structure. Did they mention figures? Not yet, Marcus responded, but they will. He was right. By noon, an offer arrived. The number was double what I had been earning. The title attached to it was Vice President. The language described significant executive authority and expanded decision-making scope. After everything, after the walk down the hall with the cardboard box, after the photograph with the red marker, after being made into a risk on a reception wall rather than a person who had spent more than a decade building things that actually worked. Now they were offering me a promotion to come back. Not because anything had changed about how they saw me, because they needed access to what I could do. Those are not the same thing. I've never confused them. What do you want me to tell them? Marcus asked. Nothing yet, I said. Good, he replied. Around the same time, James forwarded me something unexpected. Someone had posted the photograph online, the one from reception, my face with the red marker across the bottom. Within hours, the post had spread across professional networks and industry communities. Former colleagues began sharing their own observations. Former contractors added context. Current staff members, posting anonymously, added details that only people inside the building could have known. The response was overwhelming. Not because the acquisition had paused, because of what the image represented. Someone who had spent 12 years building something essential had been reduced to a warning label on the way out. The story was no longer internal, and once a story leaves the building, it belongs to everyone. Another message from James. The communications team is in full emergency mode. They want the photo taken down. Too late for that. Far too late. Marcus called again later that afternoon. Amusement was evident in his voice even before he spoke. The offer has been revised. What are they saying? Double the original salary, a vice president title, expanded executive authority, and what appears to be a sincere attempt at an apology drafted by someone in legal. I was quiet for a moment, then an idea formed. It wasn't complicated, it was simply accurate. Tell them I'm not available as an employee, I said. Marcus waited. What I mean is, I'm not an employee anymore. I'm a business, and businesses don't accept employment offers. They discuss service contracts. 20 minutes later, Marcus sent his response on my behalf. It was polished, professional, and left absolutely no room for misreading. Ms. Catherine Moore thanks Meridian Core Solutions for their revised offer and respectfully declines. She is no longer pursuing employment within corporate structures. Should Meridian Core require access to her expertise, that access may be available through Moore Compliance Strategy Group, LLC. All engagements are subject to current market rates, formal contractual review, advanced retainer requirements, and scheduling availability. The response landed like a stone in still water. According to James, the email circulated through the executive offices faster than almost anything he had seen. Some people were furious, others were finally understanding exactly what had happened. And some, a smaller number, were beginning to grasp the lesson underneath the situation. That evening, James sent me a final message for the day. You turned yourself into the answer they have to pay for now. I looked at that line for a moment before responding. I didn't turn myself into anything, I wrote back. They made me into what I am now. When I chose to close the laptop and step away from the desk, there were 3 new emails waiting from the board requesting a formal conversation. I let them sit. For 12 years, I had arranged my schedule around other people's urgency. The request would still be there in the morning. What was different now was that responding to them was a choice I got to make entirely on my own terms. The collapse became official on a Thursday. The announcement moved through financial news at 7:17 in the morning. Brief, direct, without any softening. Due to unresolved compliance deficiencies and critical authorization failures, Pinnacle Accord has elected to withdraw from acquisition proceedings with Meridian Core Solutions. We appreciate the efforts of all involved parties. That was everything. A year of strategy, celebration, and preparation erased in less than 40 words. Before 9 in the morning, investors were issuing emergency requests. Before 10, the company's stock had begun falling in a way that wasn't going to stop quickly. By midday, the damage was impossible to contain through any normal communication strategy. Every executive who had stood in front of investors promising a historic transformation was now standing in front of those same investors explaining a historic failure. And the explanation that fit was the one no one wanted to say out loud. A $300 million acquisition had collapsed because the company fired the one person who made it work. I had toast and coffee that morning. James sent me a message just after 8. It's over. Pinnacle officially pulled out. I read it and set the phone aside. What I noticed, sitting there in my kitchen, was the absence of the feeling I might have expected. There was no satisfaction. There was something much quieter than that. Relief. For years, I had organized my entire professional life around preventing disasters. Now one had happened without any input from me. The systems had simply done what they were built to do. And the world had continued moving. Marcus called before noon. They've lost the deal, he confirmed. There's more, he added. The board session yesterday apparently became quite direct. Investors started asking the questions that had been avoided since the beginning. Why was the transition handled without legal review? Why wasn't a replacement certified before the termination was finalized? Why did no one on the acquisition team raise a concern? Why did an employee with 12 years of institutional knowledge get walked out with a security escort and a photograph on the wall? Each question added pressure to a structure that was already failing. 3 days after Pinnacle's withdrawal, Garrett Walsh submitted his resignation. The official statement described it as a mutual and voluntary transition. Everyone inside the building understood what had actually happened. The board needed to demonstrate accountability to investors. Garrett had been the one who pushed for the restructuring. Garrett had signed off on my removal. Garrett became the answer to the question of who was responsible. For once, the person who ended up holding the blame had actually earned it. His departure didn't reverse any of the damage. The deal was gone. The losses were real. The public impression of the company had shifted in ways that press releases couldn't easily fix. But Meridian Core still had a problem that went beyond optics. The infrastructure I had built was still running. The systems were still active. And there was no one left who fully understood them. A week after everything collapsed, the first formal contract request arrived. Not from HR, not from any of the executives I had known. From their legal department, which had apparently learned its lesson about what language to use when reaching out to me. The tone of the message was markedly different from my termination notice. Measured, respectful, careful. They needed licensing access to several compliance frameworks I had developed during my time with the company. through my company, at standard consulting rates, exactly the way Marcus had described it months before. I reviewed the proposal sitting at my home desk in a room that felt nothing like any workspace I had ever occupied before. No overhead lights, no background noise of open-plan office life, no one walking past my chair to ask for something, just the particular silence that allows clear thinking. More requests followed, one the following week, then another, then two more in the same month. Companies that had worked adjacent to Meridian Core during the acquisition process began reaching out independently. Some needed compliance reviews, others needed structural assessments. A few wanted ongoing contractual relationships. Apparently, becoming the person at the center of a collapsed $300 million transaction was, in an unexpected way, a demonstration of expertise that spoke for itself. I hadn't advertised anything. I had simply been exactly who I was. And the work had made its own case. 3 months after leaving that building with a cardboard box, More Compliance Strategy Group had more client engagements than I could comfortably manage alone. I brought in staff, I established partnerships, I built processes the way I had always imagined building them, without navigating someone else's politics, without managing someone else's ego, without pretending that performance was the same thing as effectiveness. One afternoon, a package arrived at the house. There was no return label, no attached card. Inside was a small wooden plaque, simply finished, understated in the way that only deliberate choices are. Beneath it was a folded note with a single handwritten line. Some foundations only become visible once they're gone. No signature. But I knew immediately who had sent it. Nathan from Pinnacle Accord. I placed the plaque on the shelf behind my desk, not as a record of victory, as something more useful than that. A reminder, there is a durable misunderstanding in professional environments about where real authority lives. People tend to locate it in whoever speaks the most, whoever holds the largest title, whoever occupies the chair at the head of the longest table. They are usually looking in entirely the wrong direction. The people who hold things together are rarely the loudest people in the room. They are the ones solving problems before anyone else realizes the problems exist. They are the ones whose departure reveals, sometimes at catastrophic cost, exactly how much invisible work was being done and exactly how much it was worth. Meridian Core Solutions had looked at me after 12 years and seen a line item to be reduced. What they hadn't looked at, not once, not carefully, was the foundation beneath the line item. By the time they understood what they had dismantled, the lesson had already cost them more than they had ever expected to spend. Late one evening, a new email arrived in my inbox. Subject line, requesting terms for engagement. The sender was Meridian Core. I looked at the message for a while without opening it. Then I set the laptop aside and looked out the window at the dark sky settling over the neighborhood. At some point during the past several months, something had quietly shifted. For 12 years, I had spent my professional energy proving my value to an audience that was never truly paying attention. Now that same audience was the one requesting access. I no longer needed to demonstrate anything. The results had done that on their own. I picked up the coffee cup that was sitting beside the keyboard and took a slow sip. The evening was completely still. Outside the window, the street was empty and unhurried. The work ahead was entirely my own, built on my terms, according to my standards, for clients who understood what they were paying for. And for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, the future didn't feel like something I was racing toward. It felt like something that was already quietly on its way to me.